Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Sharon Skembry, and we're here today to talk about writing as a key component of business communications. Working from the Rents and Lents 2018 text on business communications, we're focused on Chapter 2, all about techniques involved with writing effectively. So let's get going. So writing is something that people may be hesitant to learn about and hesitant even to do. We might hear about people experiencing writer's block, but let me tell you, there's techniques involved with writing, and writing can actually be a very fun and creative process. So some of the techniques that we're going to learn about in today's discussion is how to write effectively in terms of the people that you want to read your messages, writing effectively in terms of what you want your audience to take away from reading your messages, and the best communication channel, the best suited for your written message. Okay, so this is chapter 2 of Rents and Lets. They start out the chapter with the emphasis on pointing to communication is a major and essential part of business. The stated objectives for this chapter include understanding the importance of skillful writing in effective business practice, describing what that writing process is and what effective writing strategies are. We'll look at different purposes in terms of formal letters or maybe organizational memos. We'll also look at email in terms of purpose and form as a business communication. And we'll work on understanding the nature and business of other communication media. Then, of course, we'll close the chapter with how technology is impacting business communications. Okay, so this graphic tells us that there's 3 stages to the writing process. Ideally, we begin with a planning process. Then we'll move on to a drafting process where we're actually doing the writing. And that's not where it ends. Revision is very much an important part of the writing process. Okay, so Rents and Lents talk about how 30% of your time should be dedicated to the planning task, and 30% of your time needs to be dedicated to the drafting, the actual writing process, and put aside 30% of your time that you have available to revise whatever it is that you're writing. Okay, so if we have an hour to write up a memo or an email, for example, an email that goes out to 1,200 employees because you're the director of HR, right? So this is an important email that might be announcing some sort of new organizational policy that's about to go into effect, and you want to let the employees know that this policy is being announced and it takes effect on such and such a date. So you plan your email in the first instance, right? So you want to identify what is the goal of this email. Well, it needs to inform employees of what the policy is, how the policy affects them, and what is the date that this policy becomes effective. Now, your audience in this case is internal employees. So you have to understand that your employees are going to want to know, how does this policy affect them in any way, shape or form? You might want to talk to a few employees first to kind of gauge what their reactions might be. And you may want to preempt any possible negative reactions in the planning stages of your email. And I'm flagging here that this message that we are sending out is an email communications. That is the form of the written message. But because it's announcing an organizational policy, maybe as well as an email being sent out to our 1,200 employees, maybe we also want to post a hard copy memorandum, also referred to as a memo, an organizational internal memo, which is like a hard copy announcement that might be placed on certain strategic points within the organization, like the lunchroom, like near the photocopier, like in the corridor on a bulletin board, for example. If it's important enough, maybe it needs to be a formal letter that is snail mailed out to all employee residential addresses. So we need to plan how we are going to communicate this message about a new organizational policy in our role as Director of HR. Okay, so we've planned our message, and now we're going to begin the writing process where we are actually drafting up our message that's going to go out. Now, we have to be flexible in this process. So we might be changing our minds multiple times as to what goes first and what goes last. But regardless, in this drafting process, you want to be persistent in your efforts and use your own favorite strategies. You know, maybe you have whatever music playing in the background. Maybe you have, as I do, a cup of tea in front of you all day long, right? Whatever helps you in your writing efforts, then this is where they need to be employed. So I actually have certain writing rituals that I use. One of them is to give myself a 45-minute timeline in where I sit down for those 45 minutes and I write for those 45 minutes. I do not get up off my chair. Before I sit down, I make sure I've got my cup of tea and my refills on hand. I make sure that my phone is turned off for those 45 minutes so that I cannot be disturbed. And similarly with my email, so that I close my email so that in that 45 minutes that I'm dedicating to writing, I'm not reacting to emails that are coming in that may not be urgent or may not be important. And even if they are, I will get to them after my 45 minutes of writing. Now, once I've drafted up, or once you've drafted up this email, memo, formal letter, we take another look at it. So this is the revising stage of the writing process. We want to look at the wording that we've used. We want to look at what we've put first, middle, and last. We want to look at our sentence structures and the particular words within the sentences that we've used. Maybe we'll adjust a particular word here and there. Maybe we'll break a few sentences up so that they are short and sharp and more impactful. We definitely want to use a spell checker, but also when I'm doing a final draft, typically I will at least read it out loud to see if I can pick up any minor errors that I might have missed earlier. Another way is maybe print it out and edit it longhand. This is another form of revision. So once you've gone through this writing process of planning, drafting, revising, once you've gone through that process once, that's not where it ends. Go back and do the process again. Maybe you will take another look at what were the initial goals that you set out to achieve with this communication that you're sending out to 1,200 employees. Maybe you've spoken to a few more sample employees to gauge their possible reactions, and you're realizing that, okay, this is going to be a contentious issue and you need to tread carefully here. So the way that the information is portrayed, the way that the policy is detailed and communicated needs to be carefully articulated. And given that we've now recognized that this is a highly contentious issue, that this policy announcement, we definitely need to do email, we need to do hard copy memo, and we need to do formal letter to all employees to make sure that they are fully informed and able to accurately understand the benefits of whatever policy is being announced. You know, maybe the goal of the communication needs to be informative, yes, but informative to the extent that employees understand how this contentious policy is actually going to benefit them. Okay, so maybe then they're assuming that it's not going to be beneficial. So their initial reaction might be negative. And so maybe the goal of the communication needs to counter through being comprehensively informative. Okay, so keeping that revised goal in mind now, we go back to the drafting process, right? So maybe we want to fully redraft, or maybe we just want to restructure what we've already done. Whatever, be flexible and keep going. So once we've gone through that writing session again, then go to the revising process, step in the process, right? Look at your sentence structure. Look at the words that you're using. Is there a better, more effective way to make that point? Is there a way that you can strengthen your argument to some extent? And maybe on this second round, instead of us trying to proofread our own work, maybe we'll show it to somebody else. Okay, so now we're at the second revision stage. And you know what? It doesn't end there. A third round of this writing process is not unusual, especially when it's an important conversation. And for myself, as a well-published author, my fourth textbook came out in the summer, just gone, 2020, and I have more than 50 journal and conference publications. And some of those publications, I was writing and revising and restructuring and rewriting and revising over and over again to ensure that what I was aiming to communicate was communicated in the most effective way. Now, of course, the editors helped with what and how needed to be revised, but there's a definite process. And my point is that writing is a process, right? Writing is at least a three-stage process, but this is a three-stage process that is repeated. And each time we repeat this three-stage process. We take the level of our writing, the standard of our writing, up a notch or two, and this is a good thing. So if you're not doing the planning stage, if you're not doing the revising stage, if you're not repeating this three-stage writing process, then your writing is not as effective as it could possibly be. Okay, so this slide tells us about the planning stage of the writing process. We want to determine the goals. You know, do we want to inform? Do we want to persuade, maybe? Do we want to remind? What is the goal of this communication message? Who is your audience? Is your audience internal employees? Is your audience external customers? Is your audience a government agency? Is your audience shareholders of the organization, right? Okay, so we want to gather our information. We want to be as informed as possible. So we need to gather our information that's relevant to whatever message that we're sending out. We want to analyze that information and organize that information. And when we've done that, then we can choose the form of the communication, the channel of communication, and the format of the communication. Okay, so here's a question for you, and we'll talk more about this in class, but it's a hot, humid summer, and you're the manager of a hotel, and guess what? The air conditioner's crapped out, right? So what are you going to do? You have to communicate to the current guests. So how are you going to do that? And you have to plan on communicating this to the guests. What about when the guests complain? How are you going to respond? Again, this is each of these two steps of informing the guests that the air conditioner's gone down and then responding to any potential guest complaints. These two forms of communications, each of them needs to go through the planning, the drafting, the revising process. Okay, so there are tools, software tools that you can use. One of the project planning tools that I use quite often is a Gantt chart, and a Gantt chart is used by project managers. So a Gantt chart tells us that this project is going to need to be communicated over the next 6 months, and we need weekly reminders about what needs to be done over the next 6 months, and our Gantt chart is going to help us plan that out. What needs to be done on what day across that 6-month time period. And so at the end of that 6 months, we have indeed achieved our goal of writing whatever task we set out to do. Now, when I use a Gantt chart, I will put reminders into my calendar, you know, on this day of week 1 of our 6-month timeline, this needs to be done. And I put a reminder to myself. A week later, I need to be at a different stage of the communication process. And maybe I'll even put a 1-day notification that this needs to happen tomorrow. So using the electronic calendars and the functions within the e-calendars can very much help us keep on track with our writing process. Now, of course, the internet is very handy, and other organizational tools such as databases and Excel spreadsheets can be very helpful. So can statistical programs such as SPSS to help us do a better job of presenting useful information. So instead of presenting raw statistics, for example, you might present a bar chart. Okay, now, once we get past the planning stage of the writing process, we're into the drafting process. Here is where we actually write. And you know what? Key here is to just sit down and write. Give yourself a 15-minute time time window, right? And don't get up off your chair for that 15 minutes. Just write. And if you think, oh, I've got nothing to write, then write that. I've got nothing to write. Just practice writing. It doesn't have to be perfect grammar in this drafting stage. Just get it out of your head and down on paper, or on into your Word document, for example. Just keep going. If you need your cup of tea, make sure you've got your cup of tea. As I do every day. All right. So working in Microsoft Word, for example, there's certain features that can help us. There's spelling and grammar help available. There's built-in styles and themes available. There's automatic saving and recovery functions available. There's also speech recognition. So I'm sure that you have some of your favorite functions to help in Word and other word processing software. Now, when you get to the revision stage of the writing process, you want to take a good hard look at what you've written. Maybe there's a time gap in between when you've drafted it up and when you start the revision process. So by allowing yourself that time gap, you're allowing yourself to look at it with fresh eyes. It's really hard to edit your own work. And when you've forgotten what you've written, basically, it's easier to revise it. Or another strategy is to hand it to somebody else and get them to revise it or proofread for you. And as I mentioned before, another technique that I use is to read it out aloud, or maybe print it out and edit it longhand. Okay, so here's some word processing features that will help with the revising and the editing stage. There's the find and replace feature. So if you find a spelling error that has been carried all the way through the document, you can just use a find and replace function. Comment and track. Using track changes is very useful when you're collaborating with somebody else for the document, for the communication message that needs to go out. And similarly with embedded comments, you can flag that, okay, this needs to be expanded, or this needs to be reduced, or this is missing here, or suggest such and such a person adds in such and such a detail here. So, when you add in a comment like that, then you can, there is also functions within Microsoft Word, for example, where you can respond to the comment as in done, or working on it, or maybe it's fixed completely and so you can delete the comment. Autocorrect is as lovely as it is terrible. Don't we all know that? But autocorrect is excellent for picking up on difficult spelling of words. It's also very useful when I'm writing or revising in a hurry. So my advice is don't rely on autocorrect. And sometimes I would deliberately turn it off. And a good reason to turn off autocorrect is to improve my spelling skills. Okay, so just like I don't rely on autocorrect, I similarly do not recommend to rely on spell check. But spell check in Microsoft Word will also pick up grammar errors, and it will enable you, if you right click, then you can pick up the possible correct spelling or improved grammar suggestions. Similarly, right click, you can pick up some synonyms that you might find in the thesaurus. I've already mentioned grammar, and oh, I've got an error there. Look at that. De-identification. It's a spelling error there that PowerPoint didn't pick up for me. What de-identification is when you go into the details, the properties of a Word document, you can actually make sure that the document is anonymous by inspecting the document for identifiers, and they can be automatically removed if you so choose. Now, when we're looking at a choice across different message forms in the business context, we have the formal letter option, of course, for formal communications. We have the internal memo option. We have email, that can be internal or external, and then more informally, we have texting and instant messaging. And then if we want to send a short message out to the world, maybe various platforms in social media are an option that needs to be considered. Whatever the medium of communication that's used, whatever the channel of communication that is chosen, we need to consider the various options before we decide. So I wonder, which channels of communication do you use more often in your work context? And which channels of communication do you see businesses using more often than not, or maybe more effective than other forms? And why do you think they might be more effective or not? So formal letters are the most traditional form of business communication. They're used to correspond typically outside an organization. They're not as formal as they once were, and they're used strategically for achieving a business goal. Here's an example of a formal letter. So note it's on the organizational formal letterhead. So this is flagging to Diane Taylor, the recipient of this letter, that this is a formal organization from, sorry, this is a formal communication from the Ralston Plumbing Organization. Diane Taylor is informed of the date that this communication was made, and it clearly identifies who is the recipient of the letter. It has an opening address to Miss Taylor, so it's formally addressing, you know, it's formally suggesting to Miss Taylor that the following communication is important, blah, blah, blah. Thank you for letting our technicians to serve you recently. Here is $25 towards your next purchase, and we look forward to serving you again. It doesn't end before there is a call to action. Please be sure to visit our website, and here is the website, or our Facebook page to see what other services we are offering. formal salutation at the end, sincerely, a signature by Jack the owner. Jack is owner and president of Ralston's Plumbing, and this letter would have been snail mailed out to Miss Taylor. Okay, so Ralston Plumbing thinks that it's important enough to invest in their client base. Miss Taylor obviously has used Ralston Plumbing previously, and Jack Ralston wants Diane Taylor to use Ralston's Plumbing again. And so he is giving Miss Taylor an incentive to repeat purchase in a formal manner. So Jack is investing not only the time and effort to plan, write, and revise this formal letter, but also the cost of the stamp and the envelope to send Miss Taylor this formal letter. Now, memos are typically for internal audiences. They are used for more formal purposes than an internal email, like, for example, when the director of HR is announcing a new policy. So the new policy might go out an email, but it might be reinforced with a hard copy formal memo as well. It's formatted with the date, the recipient of the memo, who the memo is from, as well as a subject line. Memos, internal organizational memorandums, known short as memos, are meant to share factual, problem-related info and can be classified as reports, even used as evidence, for example, of such and such a process having taken place, such and such a message having been communicated, or policy being communicated. And but as technology is increasingly adopted within organizations, electronic forms of communication, such as an email, being used in tandem, in combination with an internal memo, or even replacing the internal memo. Here's an example of what an internal memo looks like. So it's clearly saying that this memo is to Mr. Lenigan, the president. It's from Patent Cubisec in public relations. It's copied to the chair. It's dated May 1st, 2018. And it's all about the meeting of the Plant Safety Committee. As agreed, we will meet again on March 12th. As agreed on March 30, we will meet again on March 12th. And here's the requested agenda items. All righty. So here's some considerations of whether you think it's a good idea to send a memo or not. Now, all employees typically have email access, but not all employees regularly access their email. Like, for example, factory workers on the factory floor. They're not in front of the computer all day long like the supervisors and the managers are. So in which instances would you send a memo instead of an email? And here's some particular context to consider. You want to circulate a print journal that features reviews of the products of your organization to the key team members. What do you think? Memo or email? Well, you want to disseminate the information quickly, and you want to be able to track that this communication was made, and therefore probably an email. So I'll let you consider the rest of these scenarios, and we'll see if we've got time to talk about it a little bit more in class. So the advantages of email, as I've just flagged, is efficiency. emails are quick and they're free. They do cost time, however, to craft, especially when the director of HR is sending a new policy announcement to all employees. And in that scenario, yes, we're sending this email. Yes, we need to take time to craft it. And because it's a new policy announcement, we're also going to send it out in an internal memorandum, an internal memo. So there needs to be consistency between the email that goes out and the memorandum that goes out. And so maybe these two are planned and drafted and revised, repeat cycle before either of those emails or the memorandum goes out. So another advantage of email is that it speeds up the decision-making process, and it also provides a written record, like I just flagged. The email is able to be tracked, that this policy announcement was made on this day to all of these employees on this mailing list. But the disadvantage is that it's not confidential. Anybody can forward that email, either internal or external to the organization. And while email is an effective way to communicate most times, sometimes email communications can be problematic because talking face-to-face with somebody or making up a quick email message, maybe we're not as articulate as we might have been or could have been. And maybe our message is a little ambiguous and it's misunderstood, and you might not have communicated what you meant to communicate. Also, somebody who's receiving an email that is vague and ambiguous and possibly misunderstood, they might be upset. And unfortunately, some people may react to an ugly email with an emotional message. That's not a good idea. And another disadvantage with the email is that people can just choose to click the delete button, you know, or maybe they don't even bother. Maybe it just goes in to the ignore folder. Yeah. So even when you're responding to an email, you need to go through that 3-stage writing process. Plan your response. What do you want the recipient of your email reply to take away from your message? Do you want them to know how upset you are about whatever message has come through? Maybe you want them to know how professional you are, and therefore when you're planning it, you're deliberately planning to remove the emotive content. And maybe you'll have to draft and revise multiple times in order to remove that emotive content. And here is where that time gap in between when you draft it and when you revise your message, if you allow yourself at least overnight to take another look at it in the morning when you've got a clear head and you've managed to calm down a little bit, you might have a different view on what needs to be communicated and what needs to be revised out of your email response to an ugly message. Okay, now let's take a close look at this email, right? Now, you have a recipient of your email. You can choose to include a copy to a supervisor, for example, or maybe you want to put it in a blind copy to your assistant, your personal assistant. It's important to include a short subject line 5 to 7 words that clearly describe the content of the message. The opening salutation will flag whether this email is formal, informal, or maybe generic. Of course, depends on the purpose of the email and the recipients of the email and the relationship that you have or don't have with the recipients. The message needs to be succinct and to the point, and typically my personal rule with email, if it's more than 3 lines, it needs to be either a face-to-face or a phone call, maybe a Zoom meeting. So long emails are not a good idea. Just like the opening salutation, the closing salutation will flag whether the email is formal or informal, but regardless, the opening salutation, the tone of the message, and the closing salutation needs to be consistent, whether this is a formal, informal, or generic message going out. And maybe it's necessary to include an attachment that gives more detail on whatever your message is. Or maybe it's the message is about, please see the attached report, and you give a summary in your email message about that attached report. It's not a good idea just to forward whatever report and say, please see attached. That's not professional. Give people a reason. Give your email recipient a reason to look at whatever attached report. Let them know why it's important for them to look at the attached report. Give them a heads up about what is this attached report. So I've started in here flagging that there's typical email mistakes. You know, the vague subject lines such as meeting, not a good idea. Just forwarding, please see attached, not a good idea. Hiding the main point of the email, you know, maybe you've stated, you know, at the end of a long message, a long email message, you've said at the end, this message is really important, and I would I request a meeting to discuss. But because you've buried it right at the back end of the message, maybe the recipient of the email got bored halfway through your message and didn't get to the back end of the message. And so they didn't see your request for a follow-up meeting. Maybe they thought your subject headline of meeting was referring to the meeting that you had yesterday, you know. Now, another mistake is using that BCC to be sneaky in your communication. So, like, when you are communicating to a fellow worker that they have, you know, breached XYZ policy, if you are including the supervisor in there, in the BCC, then the recipient of your email message is not going to see that the supervisor is blind copied into this communication. And so maybe they'll fall into the trap of admitting that they accidentally breached whatever policy. And so then action needs to be taken. And that's not transparent. That's not a good idea. There's more professional ways to go about acknowledging a breach of policy, or bringing to light a breach of policy, or raising a contentious issue, other than blind copying the line supervisor or the area manager. Okay, grammar and other mechanical issues that can be sorted with functions in in the writing process, not proofreading an email, you know, yeah, okay, typos might be acceptable for informal emails, but not for formal emails. And so here is just some of the email mistakes that we make too often. And maybe you have other email issues to highlight. Okay, let me just fix that for a minute. So even something as mundane as writing an email, there's all sorts of tips and tricks, and maybe you know some that I don't know. But what I've learned is that we need to be very careful with sensitive material. We need to be accurate in who needs to receive whatever communication you're sending out. If it's a formal email communication, maybe you need to copy the chain of command and make sure you don't leave out anybody important. You definitely need to proofread and ensure that your signature, your email signature, is accurate and not offensive. Now, as our technology has evolved, electronic messaging has definitely become an increasingly important part of business communications, including text messaging and instant messaging. Now, we're typically talking about a communication here of about 150 characters. So just like it's not a good idea to send a long email, and like I said before, my personal rule is if it's any longer than 3 lines, it needs to be a personal communication, a face-to-face, a Zoom call or a phone call. And text messaging is, instant messaging is even shorter than that, with a recommended maximum of 150 characters. And so it's useful to get a quick notification out, but it's definitely short. You need to strive for clarity. It has a conversational tone, so it's typically not used for formal communications. You can adapt the messages to suit whatever audience you are communicating with, but at all times, for business communications, it needs to be professional. So here is a situation where you are asked to consider which text is more appropriate. So Marina Smith is a visiting guest to your place of business, and she's due to turn up in a couple of hours for lunch. And you've just found out that she's vegetarian, and there's this important business lunch that's scheduled, and your direct report, the person who is your supervisor, is in a meeting and you can't interrupt. So you want to send a quick text message. Here's one option. You say that Marina Smith is a vegetarian. Where shall we take her to lunch today? Question mark. Zach. So Zach is the sender of the text message. Here's another option. Text message to the supervisor from Zach. The supervisor's in a meeting. Marina Smith is a vegetarian. Shall we go 1, to the fish house, 2, soup plantation, 3, Mandarin house. All are available at noon. Zach. Okay, maybe you can figure your own version of what is a better text message. But looking at option 1 and 2, I would suggest that 2 is a better option, because you are In the first option, you are raising an issue and you're not giving any solutions. In the second option, you are giving your supervisor two options, or three options actually, where they can just answer very quickly, 1, 2, or 3, and so their mind is not taken away from the meeting, the important meeting that they're participating in at that time. So I would go for option 2 rather than option 1, or maybe you can figure out a better way. On social media is very much an effective business communication tool. While college students may be well versed in social media as a social tool, guess what? It's an important business tool as well. And some organizations, of course, are doing a better job than others. And some organizations are doing a better job of keeping up with the proliferation of social media platforms than others. And so I wonder, which businesses and which brands do you see on social media that are doing a good job with their business communications? And what are those messages? What are the channels of communication? In other words, which social media platforms are they using? Now, this infographic gives us clues on what to put out and how to put it out, but basically Facebook, Twitter, Instagram are at the top of the list in terms of social media business communication tools, business communication channels, social media platforms. Okay, so social media enables an organization to communicate with external audiences, such as their customers, their client base. It enables businesses to communicate about in a promotional manner, so with a persuasive message. Social media also enables internal communications with platforms such as Yammer, for example, or maybe students communicate with WhatsApp or GroupMe, right? And LinkedIn is a platform where professional networking is highly effective. And guess what? Employers, when they're looking to recruit a potential employee, one of the first things they're going to do is check out your social media. And yes, they will make hiring decisions based on what they see. Rents and Lents 2018 report that 69% of employers rejected a potential hire based on what they saw on social media. Dire warning there. Clean it up, people. Okay, so if you are in a business communication role and you're in charge of developing a new social media policy for a startup app design firm, you have some apps in development that are top secret, and they're top secret deliberately because of piracy concerns. So here's some questions that you need to consider in your role. What will you restrict in terms of employees posting on social media? How are you going to enforce that? What will you encourage employees to post on social media? And how are you going to achieve that goal? What will you communicate specifically in terms of organizational policies regarding confidentiality for employees or to employees, and how are you going to make that communication? And we end our discussion today by reflecting on future technology. Just as we see currently, the proliferation of social media platforms will continue into the future. Maybe one of you listening to me will be the developer and the founder of the next great, brilliant social media platform. And good luck to you. Mobile communications are increasingly being used as a business solution for business communications. And cloud computing is definitely part of the process of ensuring that information is easily accessible to, for example, your employees. So cloud computing is increasingly being used for effective business communications. So I think, yep, that's it for chapter 2 from Rents and Lents. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll see you again soon.